In the grand concert hall of Bellemere, the evening lights shimmered softly across polished wooden floors. The seats were filled with music lovers dressed in elegance, their eyes fixed on the stage where the annual Harmony Gala was about to begin. Among the performers stood Victor Hale, a name well known in the world of classical music. He was the violin prodigy who carried arrogance like a badge of honor and talent that made him untouchable in his own eyes. Victor had won countless awards, his performances praised by critics, but his attitude often left a bitter taste behind. He believed no one could match his skill, especially not amateurs or unknown musicians who dared to share a stage with him. That evening, a newcomer had been added to the list of performers, a shy woman named Lila Bennett. Her name meant nothing to the crowd, and when Victor saw her name next to his on the program, he let out a smug laugh. He spotted her backstage, standing quietly in a corner, clutching her violin case with both hands, as if it were her only shield. He approached her, his shoes clicking against the floor with deliberate rhythm. "So you are Lila," he said, his voice dripping with mock amusement. "I hope you are not nervous. You know, it can be embarrassing to play before real musicians." Lila looked up, her gentle eyes calm but unreadable. "I just came to play what I love," she said softly. "I am not here to compete." Victor smirked. "That is good, because you would lose miserably," he replied, and walked away, leaving a trail of laughter behind him. Lila exhaled slowly, her hands trembling slightly. She had never performed for such a large audience before. But her late father's violin rested in her hands, and that gave her strength. He had always told her that music was not about perfection, it was about truth. The curtains rose, and one by one the performers took their turns, each earning polite applause. When Victor stepped on stage, the crowd cheered louder. His reputation alone demanded admiration. He played with precision, each note sharp, each movement calculated. He wanted the audience to see not just his music, but his dominance. When he finished, the crowd erupted in applause. His pride swelled as he bowed deeply, soaking in the praise. And then it was Lila's turn. The applause faded, replaced by murmurs. Some people whispered, wondering who she was. She walked to the center of the stage, her step small but steady. Her old violin gleamed faintly under the lights. Victor stood near the side of the stage, watching with crossed arms, a smirk still playing on his lips. Lila took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and raised her bow. The first note that left her violin was soft, barely a whisper, yet it carried through the hall with haunting beauty. The room fell silent. Then came the second note, and the third, blending into a melody so raw, it seemed to speak directly to the soul. Her hands moved gracefully, the bow dancing across the strings as if guided by something greater than skill alone. Every sound she produced carried emotion, sadness, longing, hope, and love, all entwined together. People in the crowd leaned forward. Some closed their eyes, others felt tears rising without understanding why. Even Victor's smirk began to fade, replaced by a frown of confusion, then disbelief. Her music was not technical perfection, it was something deeper, something that could not be measured or compared. Lila's face remained calm, her expression soft, as if she were lost in another world, one where only she and her music existed. The final note lingered in the air long after her bow had stopped moving, a delicate thread of sound that held everyone in silence. No one clapped at first because they were too stunned to remember how. Then, as if waking from a dream, the audience erupted in applause, so loud it shook the hall. Victor stood frozen, his hands clenched, his pride wounded in a way he had never experienced before. Lila bowed her head humbly and smiled faintly before stepping off the stage. Backstage, Victor stared at her as she walked past, unable to find words, his arrogance melting into something unfamiliar. Lila looked at him gently and said, "My father once told me music is not about who plays louder or faster, it is about who speaks from the heart." Victor said nothing, his chest tight with emotions he could not name. Lila continued down the corridor, her violin in hand, the echo of her melodies still haunting every corner of the hall. And from that night on, every time Victor picked up his violin, he could still hear her music in the back of his mind, reminding him of something he had long forgotten. The hall that once belonged to arrogance had been conquered by sincerity and soul. And though Lila disappeared quietly after that performance, her name lingered among those who had witnessed that night when music itself seemed to breathe through her. The next day, the newspapers called it a miracle performance, and even Victor could not bring himself to disagree. Deep inside. He knew he had been humbled not by fame or force, but by pure and honest sound. Lila Bennett had changed something in him and in everyone who had heard her play that night. He could not stop thinking about it as he returned to his practice room, lifting his bow slowly, remembering how she had closed her eyes and let the music flow as if the world itself listened in silence. Days passed, but Victor could not shake off the sound of Lila's melody from his mind. It played in his head when he woke up, it followed him when he practiced, and it echoed in his dreams when he tried to sleep. For the first time in years, the violin felt heavy in his hands, his notes precise, but empty, his rhythm flawless, yet lifeless. He tried to play her piece from memory, but he couldn't capture its soul no matter how perfectly he moved his bow. It frustrated him. He slammed the bow against the strings once, the sharp sound startling even him. He realized then that what she had done on that stage could not be imitated, it had to be felt, and he did not know how to feel anymore. Victor decided to find her. He asked around the academy, the theater, even the local music shop, but no one had seen her since the performance. It was as if she had vanished, leaving behind only whispers of her name and that unforgettable sound. Weeks later, Victor was invited to perform in a small-town festival. It was not his usual grand venue, but something in him told him to go. When he arrived, he noticed a modest stage set up in the town square, children running around, families laughing, and musicians playing simple tunes under the open sky. As he walked through the crowd, he heard a familiar sound that made him stop in his tracks. A soft, warm melody drifted through the air. It was Lila's violin, her sound unmistakable. He followed it to a small group gathered near a fountain. There she was, sitting on a wooden stool, her violin resting against her shoulder, her eyes closed as she played for a group of children. They listened quietly, mesmerized not by fame or reputation, but by the purity of her music. Victor stood there for a long time, just watching, feeling something inside him shift, like a weight lifting from his chest. When she finished, the children clapped and ran to hug her. She smiled shyly, thanking them one by one, her humility as radiant as her sound. After the crowd dispersed, Victor finally stepped forward, his heart pounding with words he had never spoken before. Lila looked up, surprised but not startled. She smiled faintly. Victor, the first, did not expect to see you here. He nodded awkwardly. I did not expect to be here either, but I have been looking for you.
Her eyes softened. Why?
Victor hesitated, searching for words that did not sound proud or defensive. I needed to understand what you did that night, he said finally, how you played like that. Lila lowered her gaze and brushed her fingers along the strings lightly. You play for perfection, she said. I play for connection, that is all. Her voice was gentle, but her words struck deep. He realized how far he had drifted from the reason he once loved music. When I was young, I used to play like that too, he said quietly, before fame, before critics, before all of this. Lila smiled and nodded softly. Then maybe it is time you remember how. They sat together for a while, not speaking, just listening to the sounds of the festival, the laughter, the chatter, the wind brushing against the strings of her violin. Then she handed him her bow. Play something, she said. Victor blinked, unsure. You want me to play here in the open? She nodded, her eyes kind. Play, without thinking, just let it come from wherever it used to. He hesitated, then lifted the violin and began to play. At first his hands were stiff, his rhythm mechanical, but as he looked around at the simple joy of the people listening, his movements softened. The music began to flow freer, warmer, more alive than it had in years. Lila smiled, watching him as the tension melted from his face, and for the first time Victor felt the music again, not as a performance, but as a conversation. When he finished, there was silence, not from awe but from peace, of feeling that filled the air around them. Lila clapped softly and said, see, it was always there, you just stopped listening to it. Victor looked at her, and for once he did not feel the need to prove anything to anyone. He realized that the truest form of mastery was not about control, but about surrender. The festival continued around them, but for Victor and Lila, time seemed to slow. They talked about music, about life, about everything that sound could express when words failed. He found himself smiling more freely than he had in years, and Lila's quiet laughter reminded him of something gentle, something real. From that day forward, they often met at small festivals or quiet gatherings, never on grand stages, but always where hearts were open to listen. And with every performance, Victor learned a little more about what it truly meant to play from the heart. Months turned into seasons, and Victor found himself traveling to smaller towns more often, leaving behind the glittering halls and marble stages he once adored. He began teaching children how to play not with rigid discipline, but with feeling, something he had learned from Lila. People noticed the change in him. He smiled more, he listened more, and his music began to sound different, warmer, deeper, truer. Every time he lifted his bow, he thought of her soft voice saying, "Play for connection, not perfection," and it became his quiet mantra. Lila, meanwhile, continued her quiet life, moving from town to town, sharing her music with anyone who wished to listen. She played in gardens, by rivers, and small cafes, and at festivals where she would sometimes meet Victor again, and their duets became small legends of their own. One evening they were invited to perform together at a charity concert in a nearby city. It was not a grand event, but the hall was filled with people from all walks of life, musicians, dreamers, and families who simply loved the sound of the violin. Victor looked at Lila before they stepped on stage. She looked calm as always, her hands steady, her eyes filled with quiet light. He whispered softly, "Are you ready?" She smiled, "I am always ready to play with you, Victor." The lights dimmed, the audience hushed, and they began to play together for the first time before a real crowd. Their music intertwined like a conversation between two souls that understood each other without words. Victor's strong notes met Lila's gentle tone, blending into something breathtaking, something neither could have created alone. The hall was silent except for their violins, the sound rising and falling like waves, carrying the listeners through emotions they could not name. By the end of the piece, the audience was still frozen in their seats, as if afraid that clapping might break the magic. Then came the applause, thunderous and heartfelt, echoing through the hall like a storm. Victor and Lila bowed, but their eyes met, and both knew that the true victory was not in applause but in the harmony they had found. After the concert, they sat together outside the hall, the night air cool, the city lights flickering in the distance. Lila leaned back, closing her eyes, and said softly, "Do you hear that, Victor?" He tilted his head, listening, but there was only the faint hum of the city.
"What do you mean?" he asked.
She smiled, "The world plays too if you listen closely. Every sound has a rhythm, every silence has a song." Victor smiled, shaking his head softly, "You always say things like that, and yet now I understand them." Lila opened her eyes and looked at him. "Music is not about the violin," she said, "it is about listening to life itself." He nodded quietly, because deep down he knew she was right. They stayed like that for a long time, sitting in silence that was not empty, but full of meaning. The stars glimmered above them, as if keeping time with the rhythm of their hearts. In the following months, their friendship grew into something deeper, something that did not need words to define it. They shared stories of their childhood, of moments when music had saved them from loneliness, when sound had become their language. Sometimes Lila would laugh at how serious Victor had once been, and he would smile, saying, "You have no idea how much you changed me." She would answer softly, "Maybe you just needed someone to remind you of what you already were." As time passed, their names began to spread again, but this time it was not for fame or rivalry. It was because, wherever they played together, people left changed. Their duets became symbols of unity, of humility, of rediscovering meaning in art and in life. And Victor, who once believed music was about mastery, now played with a heart that beat in sync with every note Lila drew from her violin. Together they brought silence to crowds and tears to those who did not even know why they cried. Their music told stories that words never could, stories of loss, hope, and rediscovery, stories that lived long after the final note faded. As the years went by, the bond between Victor and Lila deepened in ways neither of them could have expected. They became inseparable on and off the stage, not bound by romance or duty, but by something quieter and stronger, a shared understanding of purpose. They traveled to places where music was fading, from hearts to small towns scarred by hardship to schools that had forgotten art. Everywhere they went, they brought life back through sound. Lila would smile softly at the children and say, "Close your eyes and feel the story inside the notes," and even the shyest of them would try. Victor watched her during those lessons, the way her calm presence could turn fear into courage, the way her kindness could tune broken hearts as easily as strings. He realized that her true gift was not playing, it was awakening something in others that they had forgotten to feel. Sometimes when they played together, he would lose track of time, his mind empty, his soul weightless, and in those moments he understood what she had meant all along. One afternoon after a small concert in a mountain village, they sat by a stream, the sunlight catching the ripples like tiny sparks of gold. Lila traced her fingers along her violin and said softly, "Victor, do you ever think about what we will leave behind?" He looked at her, the question settling deep inside him, and he said quietly, "I used to think it would be trophies or fame. Now I think it is the people we touch." She smiled, that small warm smile that always made him feel at peace. Then she said, "That is all that really matters, isn't it?" He nodded, and for a while they said nothing, the only sound the gentle rush of water and the whisper of wind in the trees. When they returned to the village, they were greeted by a little girl holding an old violin too big for her tiny hands. She looked up at them shyly and said, "I want to play like you someday." Lila knelt beside her, her eyes shining with gentle joy, and said, "You already can, little one, just play what you feel, and the rest will come." Victor watched as the girl smiled and held her violin a little tighter. He felt something stir in him, a quiet pride that came not from success, but from knowing they had sparked something that would grow beyond them. That night they performed again in the town square under strings of lanterns, their music floating through the cool air like a story written in sound. People danced, others simply stood still listening, tears glistening under the soft light. Victor glanced at Lila mid-performance. She was radiant, her eyes half closed, her face serene, and in that instant he knew that no grand hall could ever compare to this moment. They finished the final piece together, their notes fading into the night like whispers carried by the wind. Afterward they sat among the crowd, laughing, talking, sharing food and stories with strangers who no longer felt like strangers. As the fire burned low, Victor turned to Lila and said, "You know, I used to think that music was my power, but now I see it as my bridge." Lila smiled at him, her expression tender. "It always was, Victor, you just had to walk across it." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "You always make it sound so simple." "It is simple," she said, "you just have to listen." The next morning they left the village at sunrise, the mist rising from the fields like silver smoke, their violins strapped to their backs. They walked side by side, the road stretching out endlessly ahead of them. Neither spoke for a long time. There was no need. Their silence was its own kind of melody, one that told of everything they had learned and everything they still would. As they walked farther down the winding road, the morning sun began to warm their faces, and the air filled with the scent of wildflowers growing along the path. They stopped at a small hill overlooking a valley where a tiny village lay below, smoke curling gently from chimneys and the faint sound of a bell echoing in the distance. Lila gazed at it with a soft smile and said, "It looks peaceful, doesn't it?" Victor nodded. "It does. I wonder if they love music down there." Lila laughed quietly. "Everyone loves music, even if they don't know it yet." They made their way down to the village, greeted by curious eyes and kind smiles. The people were simple folk, farmers, bakers, tailors, all living quiet lives untouched by fame or grandeur. When the villagers learned that Victor and Lila were musicians, they invited them to stay for the evening festival, saying they had not heard live music in years. Lila agreed instantly, her eyes lighting up as she said, "Then, tonight we play for them." Victor smiled, but his thoughts were distant. It had been months since they had played for strangers like this, and he found himself eager to see the spark return to people's eyes again. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the villagers gathered in the square, stringing lanterns and setting up tables filled with food. The air buzzed with laughter and anticipation. Lila tuned her violin carefully, her movements graceful and unhurried. Victor watched her quietly, still amazed by how effortlessly she carried peace wherever she went. When they began to play, the sound filled the air like a gentle wind stirring leaves, the melody rising and falling like the rhythm of life itself. Children danced near the fire, spinning in circles, their laughter blending with the music, while elders tapped their feet softly, remembering days long past. Victor closed his eyes as he played, his bow gliding across the strings. He felt the sound flow through him into the people around him, connecting them all. When the song ended, the villagers cheered, some with tears glistening on their faces, others smiling as if their hearts had been awakened. Lila looked around, her eyes full of quiet joy. "This is why I love to play," she whispered to Victor, "because music belongs to everyone, not just the ones on the stage." Victor nodded, her words sinking deep inside him. Again, every performance with her seemed to uncover another layer of meaning. Later that night, as the festival wound down, they sat together near the dying embers of the fire, the stars bright above them. Lila looked up at the sky, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes, I think music is how the universe speaks to us. Victor followed her gaze, the stars reflected in his eyes. Maybe, he said softly, maybe that's why it never really ends, it just changes form. She smiled and closed her eyes, listening to the distant hum of crickets and wind. I like to think that every note we play becomes part of something bigger, that it keeps moving even after we're gone. He looked at her and felt something he could not name, something pure and steady like the sound of her violin. It wasn't love in the ordinary sense, it was something deeper, something that felt eternal. They stayed there until the last spark of the fire faded into ash and the world grew quiet except for the steady rhythm of their breathing. When dawn came, they packed their things again, ready to move on to the next village, to the next story, waiting to be told through their music. And as they walked away from the sleepy village, the wind carried faint echoes of their song across the fields, a song that spoke of connection, of peace, and of the beauty found in listening. Years passed, and the names Victor and Lila became whispers carried through towns and valleys, places they had once visited and filled with sound. People spoke of them, not as famous musicians, but as wanderers who played from the heart, two souls who healed the world one song at a time. Children who had once watched them play grew into musicians themselves, teaching others the same way, with kindness and truth instead of pride. In time, Victor and Lila settled near the edge of a quiet lake surrounded by trees that swayed gently in the breeze, the same music that had always guided their path still living within them. They spent their mornings practicing near the water, their reflections shimmering on the calm surface, the sound of their violins blending with the wind and the calls of distant birds. Victor had changed entirely, the arrogance that once lived in his heart replaced by peace, his music no longer sharp or proud, but full of warmth and gratitude. Lila remained the same, gentle and steady, her presence as soft as the light that touched the lake at sunrise, her music still pure, still true. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the water in gold, Victor sat beside her on the old wooden pier, their violins resting beside them. He looked at her quietly for a long time before saying, "Lila, do you ever miss the big stages, the lights, the applause?" She smiled, her eyes reflecting the fading sun. "No," she said softly, "I have all the music I need right here." He followed her gaze toward the lake, listening to the quiet rhythm of the world around them, and nodded. "I think I finally understand that." Lila turned to him, her smile calm, "And knowing you always did, Victor, you just needed time to hear it." The air grew cooler as twilight settled, the first stars appearing one by one above the lake. They lifted their violins one last time and began to play together. The melody was slow and tender, carrying the echoes of every journey they had shared, every lesson, every moment of silence that had taught them more than words ever could. The sound floated across the lake, soft and endless, a song of peace and farewell, a song that belonged to no one and to everyone. When the final note faded, the world seemed to hold its breath for a heartbeat before the night took it gently away. Victor lowered his violin, his eyes glistening, and whispered, "Thank you, Lila, for everything." She smiled, her voice almost a whisper too. "Thank you for listening." And as the stars shimmered above and the water rippled below, their song lingered unseen but never lost. Because true music never ends, it only finds new hearts to live in.